The Targaryens are known for many things: conquering, architecture, having the richest and most expansive territory in the known world, and of course, dragons. But if we had to use two words to describe what drives a pureblood Valyrian dragon lord, they would be magic and madness. Magic was the basis of all Valyrian power. They used blood magic and experimented crossbreeding humans with other species in the flesh pits of Gogosos. Because of their incestuous traditions, many dragon lords would carry the taint of madness, though disfigurement was likely avoided due to their magical blood. In the near 3 centuries that the dragon lords ruled over Westeros, many in their household were examples of one kind of Valyrian or the other, and in rare cases, it was both. We will be taking a look at 10 such Targaryen kings and princes who were either obsessed with magic or possessed by some form of madness. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Maegor the Cruel. Though there's no confirmation that he was an utter lunatic in the books, Maegor was exceedingly brutal in his methods, to the point it felt like he was insane. He butchered a cat at 3, killed a palfrey at 8, took Balerion for his mount at 26, and usurped the throne at 31. His first response to disagreement was death, not dialogue. He beheaded 3 Grand Maesters as well as multiple Septons for simply disagreeing with him and his methods. He burned the seats of many houses that sided with the faith of the 7 against him, for Maegor had committed the sin of polygamy. The cruel king had 6 wives in total, but none of them gave him a son. At first it was believed that this was due to Maegor's impotency. Turns out there was treachery and sorcery involved, and it had been hinted multiple times that Maegor's reign was rooted in blood as much as it was in magic. For starters, he was born well over a decade after Aegon and Visenya's marriage, where Aenys was born a few years into Aegon's reign. It was rumored that they did not have the best relationship, and some even claimed that Visenya was barren following Rhaenys' death in 10 AC. But a year later, she announced her pregnancy, and the result was Maegor, an inhuman brute of a man who was strong, but used his strength to impose and not elevate. Maegor's inherent nature could be a result of being brought up under a hard-ass like Visenya, or the involvement of magic in his birth. The second seems less likely, but if Visenya truly was barren, it would make sense. When Maegor participated in a trial of 7 to preserve his claim to kingship, he suffered a head injury that kept him in a coma for 28 days. On the 29th day, his Pentoshi lover and rumored sorceress Tiana arrived in King's Landing, and the very next day, King Maegor woke up. That same woman is responsible for poisoning 3 of Maegor's wives, because she herself was barren, and likely jealous that she couldn't bear the king's son. For his part, Maegor could have dealt with all of what unfolded during his lifetime with much more grace, but instead, he chose violence. He brutally stamped out an entire house just because he suspected they had lied to him. He ordered the torture and death of thousands of people, including his nephew Viserys. He personally killed his other nephew Aegon, astride Balerion, and whenever Maegor marched, survivors were either put to death or sent to the wall. During one of the final campaigns of his life, he brought 2,000 skulls said to be taken from his fallen enemies to King's Landing. But by that point, people thought Maegor's cruelty to be so crazy that they wouldn't be surprised if the skulls belonged to peasants instead. His last war council saw him behead a man that suggested surrender, mount his head on a lance, and keep it on display for the rest of the meeting. He was found dead, impaled on the Iron Throne the next morning, and for once, no one went looking for a possible assassin. Aegon Targaryen II. Before we go any further, if you don't want spoilers for House of the Dragon, then you should skip over this entry, because we'll be talking about things that happen well into Season 2's timeline. Don't let Tom Glencarney's charm and incredibly attractive face fool you into thinking that Aegon is going to end up becoming a good man. History remembers him as one of the worst Targaryen kings, and rightfully so. The show did not include this scene from the books, but when Aemond returned from Storm's End, having slain Eryx and Lucerys, Aegon greets him with a massive feast. House of the Dragon portrays him as a boy king, still in the grasp of his mother and hand, but the books quickly establish him as a grasping ruler, keen on causing destruction rather than gathering his strength in silence. In Fire and Blood, Aegon doesn't fire his grandpa as Hand after taking advice from Larys Strong, though that may be possible. He does it when Otto's slow-moving strategies fail to get him the allies he needs, and the post is granted to the far more belligerent Criston Cole. The Lord Commander was a great warrior, but not a skillful diplomat. He advised Aegon to give captive lords in the Red Keep a choice between submission and death, and when many chose the latter, the Green's war efforts started unraveling. The more Aegon flew into battle, the worse his injuries became, and after a point, he turned into a cripple, not unlike Larys Strong. To keep himself functional, he drowned himself in wine and milk of the poppy, but all that did was bring out his unhinged Targaryen rage. Aegon becomes so bent on revenge that even after he deals with Rhaenyra, he wants to extinguish her line. The Greens will gain the upper hand at one point in the series, but it will be temporary, because the Black's allies will descend upon them. Even after being surrounded on all sides, Aegon refuses to surrender because he'd rather see everyone dead than lose his throne. In the end, he has to be poisoned by his own counselors, because otherwise, he'd have ended the entire Targaryen line with his actions. Aegon wasn't martial like Maegor. He fought in only one battle, and that battle left him half dead and disfigured. But he was fond of torturing people like Maegor, and also killing family members. You're about to witness all that and more soon enough. Baelor the Blessed. Having a man of faith as your king isn't a problem per se, but having a religious fanatic is, and that's exactly what Baelor the Blessed was. Baelor was the second son of King Aegon III, and unlike his brother, he grew up deeply entrenched in the faith. He became a septon at a young age, and when he was married to his sister Dana, he didn't consummate their relationship. Baelor always dressed in white, and when he became king, his crown was made of vines and flowers. The Blessed King was known for being open-handed with the common folk, so history looks back on him with great generosity. But when you take the lens of religion off your eyes, you realize that Baelor the Blessed was batshit crazy. When Baelor became king, he dissolved his marriage with Dana and put all his sisters inside the Maiden Vault to preserve their purity. They would spend nearly a decade in comfortable captivity, but captivity nonetheless. This was disastrous for the Targaryens because as princesses, all three of Baelor's sisters had immense political value, and by declaring them chaste, he was weakening the royal family's political strength. But that's nothing compared to what he does in an effort to end the war with Dorne. The mad lad walks from the Boneway to Sunspear barefoot in a sackcloth to free his brother and forge a peace. Baelor is able to do both, but we can't tell whether it was miraculous or utter madness, considering it nearly killed him. After negotiating a deal which was sealed with a marriage pact, the Prince of Dorne ordered House Wyld to release Aemon at Baelor's request. But Lord Wyld decided to play a game instead. He hung Aemon above a pit of vipers, threw the key to his cage into the pit, and told Baelor he was free to free his brother. The king walked into the pit, got bitten by the snakes, and had to be pulled into the cage by Aemon, but he got the key. Once they were free, Baelor was taken to Blackhaven and then Storm's End, because his life was in critical condition. When he recovered, his fanaticism worsened, and Baelor started putting the realm at risk. He tried to replace ravens with doves, rewarded lords who preserved their daughters' virtues with chastity belts, burned books that contained heresies like Barth's Unnatural History, prayed over a dragon's egg for half a year to make it hatch, and appointed high septons that had no idea how to handle the office. The first one was a stonemason, and the second an 8-year-old boy. Toward the end of his life, he would take to fasting so frequently that his body became gaunt as a stick, and during one such fast, he finally collapsed to his death. The small folk despaired at Baelor's death, but the lords breathed a sigh of relief, because the king had come to believe that he needed to convert non-believers by force. Baelor might have secured a pseudo-permanent peace between the crown and the faith with his fanaticism, but everything else he did became a precursor for the Blackfire Rebellion. He also put the Targaryen throne on the line multiple times by exposing himself to danger, and his hardline beliefs and practices, especially toward the end of his life, can only be called the ramblings of a madman. But speaking of Blackfires, Aegon the Unworthy. It was once said that King Aegon IV's words should have been, "Wash her and bring her to my bed." And that sounds cool and all, until you realize his genitalia spawned 5 generations of warfare. When he was a young prince, Aegon showed all the hallmarks of a decent ruler. He was charming, good with sword and lance, and cunning in matters of state. However, his fatal flaw was his lust, and it ended up turning him into the most lustful Targaryen king ever. With time, his lust started making him do things that make Aegon IV feel like Aries II. We'll explain. Aegon started off having small, harmless affairs with minor ladies and common women, but as the years went by, his desires intensified, and soon he was using his position as prince and then king to sleep with every nobleman's daughter, wife, sister, you name it. He slept with his own sister Dana after helping her escape the Maiden Vault, birthing his first great bastard, Daemon Waters. Many others would follow, like Aegor Rivers, aka Bittersteel, and Shiera Seastar. One of them is on our list, so we'll save him for his entry, but Aegon's seed was spread far and wide, and he'd do anything to spread it further. He once gave House Butterwell 3 dragon eggs so he could sleep with Lord Butterwell's maiden daughters. He had a Bracken and a Blackwood mistress, so he would take from one house and give to the other based on who he was sleeping with. He made a fleet to invade Dorne despite his predecessor Baelor's peace pact with them, and when that fleet was scattered by a storm, he commanded the pyromancers to build dragons. 7 mechanical monstrosities were created to replicate the power of House Targaryen at its peak, but when the wildfire burned half the Kingswood and all the dragons, Aegon gave up on his invasion. This harebrained scheme is quite similar to what Aerys' mind would concoct in his day and age, as you'll see soon enough. All this makes him sound pretty crazy already, but the true mark of his madness is revealed through 2 things: his treatment of his sister Nerys, and his final act in life. Aegon hated Nerys because she preferred their brother Aemon to him. She was also frail, gentle, and pious, all things the king disliked in a woman. Nerys gave birth to his son and heir Daeron, but after that, the maesters advised the king to not attempt further congress with the queen, given her frailness. Nerys asked the king for an annulment, requesting to return to their dynamic as brother brother and sister. Aegon replied that that was what they were doing, and impregnated Nerys many times after Daeron's birth, despite knowing full well it could kill her. Though he never disinherited Daeron, he started spreading rumors about his birth, and after Nerys died, he started speaking of those rumors himself. Aegon eventually became so monstrously obese that his sheer weight was killing him. His limbs had begun rotting, and people wondered how his last lover could even endure his embrace. The Unworthy had acknowledged many of his bastards from prominent houses already, and even given his son Daemon Waters the ancestral Targaryen sword Blackfire. So on his deathbed, he legitimized all his illegitimate children, and put them all in the line of succession, instigating a conflict that would end shortly before the main timeline of Game of Thrones. Arion Targaryen would become king, but Daemon Waters would take the name Blackfire, and eventually kick off a rebellion that stretched over 5 decades, and 5 separate attempts to take the Iron Throne. Aegon IV is remembered as Aegon the Unworthy by history, and rightly so. His insane lust gave the Seven Kingdoms 50+ years of war and nearly unraveled the unity of the realm, all because he couldn't keep it in his pants. Aries Targaryen I. Aerys was the 7th Targaryen king to sit the Iron Throne after the conclusion of the Dance of Dragons, and the first example of what an obsession with magic can look like. Every subsequent generation of Targaryens following the dance started getting powerful dreams about the return of the dragons, but none of them pursued those dreams as vigorously as Aerys did, and the fact that he chose to wear Aegon the Unworthy's crown should have been the first clue with regards to his aptitude for ruling. His reign lasted for 13 years, but during that time he did only one thing of note, sending one of the key Blackfire pretenders to the wall, which failed when said pretender escaped. Apart from that, Aerys spent most of his time with his nose buried in books, scrolls, and ancient prophecies. He would read until his eyes became red, and though he was married, he rarely visited his wife's bed, if ever. Aerys' entire reign came and went without an issue of his own body, and the only thing he quantifiably achieved was confirmation that one day the dragons would return. During his time as king, Westeros faced many challenges like drought, Ironborn raiding the Sunset Sea, and a third Blackfire rebellion. Aerys was content to let his Hand of the King deal with all that, while he himself worked on finding the prophecy that would help his house regain its lost power. He never did, and died leaving the realm more unsafe than his predecessor, who fought a proper war. Aerys was an example of how an obsession with magic can also be the undoing of a ruler. He could have improved the condition of the Seven Kingdoms by employing tactics less brutal than his hands, dealing with the Ironborn threat, and having kids of his own. Instead, he indulged his obsession, and that kind of thing doesn't work out for too long, even if it is for the greater good. Prince Arion Targaryen. Prince Arion Targaryen was the first overt example of what Targaryen madness truly looks like. The second son of King Maekar Targaryen liked calling himself Bright Flame, but the people that knew him called him by another name, Arion the Monstrous. When he was young, he threw his younger brother Egg's pet cat into a well, and denied it when questioned. Later, he would enter Egg's bedchambers at night, and threaten to cut his genitals off and turn him into his sister. A similar yet worse thing is done by Euron Greyjoy to his younger siblings in the books, and he's crazy in all caps. So you know he and Arion would be best buddies. This event traumatized Egg as a child, but unlike Euron's brother Aeron, he grew up to despise Arion and not fear him. If he had, Bright Flame would have likely tormented him further. Arion took the whole blood of the dragon thing a bit too seriously. All of his wardrobe and even his armor was shaped to look like flames, and the prince believed himself to be a dragon in human flesh. He was quick to take offense whenever he felt someone was disrespecting the dragon, which is why he starts a trial of 7 that ends up getting the heir to the throne killed. Arion has no regrets, and he just goes into exile to bide his time till he can return to court, and hopefully make a play for the throne. When the prince returns, he fights the third Blackfire rebellion and takes actions that live on in infamy. Considering he broke the fingers of a puppeteer for putting on a show about a dragon-slaying knight, we can't even imagine what Arion would have done during an actual war. His only sensible contribution to King Aerys' reign was suggesting the execution of Bittersteel, but Arion probably only said that just to watch the guy burn. He was married to his cousin Daenora Targaryen, and the couple were blessed with a son, but Arion named the boy Maegor, which, as you might have guessed, proved controversial. Had he lived beyond his father's lifetime, he'd have become king of Westeros, as Maekar's eldest living son, but thankfully his madness saved the realm from that prospect. In the same year that his son was born, Arion drank a cup of wildfire and burned himself to death. It is said that the prince thought doing this would turn him into an actual dragon, but all it did was kill him. It's just as well, because imagine this guy taking over after Maekar's death, which happens a year later. We probably wouldn't even get to the main timeline of Game of Thrones, because he'd level King's Landing decades before that. Aegon the Unlikely. Arion's madness wasn't entirely his fault. All of King Maekar's children had dragon dreams, and they responded differently to them. His eldest son Daeron became a drunk. Arion we've already discussed. Aemon ended up becoming Maester Aemon from Game of Thrones, and Egg ended up becoming King Aegon Targaryen V. Out of all the Targaryen kings of the 2nd century, King Egg showed the most promise. He had spent much of his life on the road with Sir Duncan the Tall, and developed a compassion for the small folk that was rivaled only by Baelor. Egg brought in reforms to give peasants more rights, and did many other things to progress the 7 kingdoms into an age of acceptance. But the nobility resisted his efforts. When he got married, Aegon was so far down the line in succession that his choice didn't matter, so he wedded the love of his life, Bethany Blackwood. But when he became king, his children inherited his willfulness and broke their arranged betrothals to live instead for love. This made Egg's position with the nobility even worse, and he put down over a half-dozen internal rebellions, alongside the 4th Blackfire Rebellion. Over time, King Aegon came to believe that the only way to enforce his vision for an equal and peaceable Westeros was with the power of dragons, and to that end, he too became obsessed with prophecy and magic. He sent voyages to Asshai in search of lore that would help him hatch dragons. He didn't oppose the arranged marriage of his grandchildren Aerys and Rhaella, because a woods witch had prophesied that the prince who was promised would be born of their line. Aegon's obsession with prophecy ended in the tragedy of Summerhall, where he allegedly tried to use wildfire and blood magic to hatch 7 dragon eggs. Aegon's obsession with dragons reduced the Targaryen dynasty to the immediate family of his son Jaehaerys, and they would disappear from Westeros soon enough thanks to Jaehaerys' successor, the Mad King Aries Targaryen II. For a character we've only heard things about, Aries Targaryen shaped much of George Martin's world with his 2-decade reign as the Mad King. He was a fine prince at one point, showing much promise in field and council. Aerys fought in the 5th Blackfire Rebellion, and became close friends with important lords like Tywin Lannister and Steffon Baratheon. But once he ascended the throne, it was as though he became an eclectic mix of Aegon the Unworthy, Maegor the Cruel, and Arion Brightflame. He was Aegon the Unworthy with his many transgressions of his marital vows. He had never had a good relationship with his wife Rhaella, but toward the end of his life, it turned into abuse. She too had many stillbirths, like Aerys Targaryen, because of her frail body, and yet the king made her give birth 8 times. Aerys was known to keep many mistresses, one of whom was rumored to be Tywin Lannister's wife. Like Maegor the Cruel, Aerys wanted to bring the 7 kingdoms to heel, with shows of force rather than diplomacy. In his early years, he would settle matters with words, as he and Tywin shared the same opinions on many things. But as people started calling his hand the true king, Aerys' paranoia and jealousy made him work against Tywin's advice at all times, which inadvertently weakened the Iron Throne. At one point, Aerys was captured by the defiant Lord of Duskendale with impunity for 6 months, and it took a daring rescue from Barristan the Bold to end the king's confinement. But perhaps they should have let him die, because that was the day Aerys Targaryen went from being kind of crazy to full-blown Mad King. He had House Darklyn and all its cadet houses tortured to death, and from that day forward, he became obsessed with fire. Aerys gave the Pyromancers Guild a lot of power and money in exchange for wildfire, which became his primary mode of arousal and execution. It was said that Aerys and Rhaella never saw each other much, but every time the king executed a traitor, he would claim his wedding rights the same night. After the defiance of Duskendale, Aerys became so paranoid that he refused to shave, bathe, cut his nails, and he didn't eat food or drink without a food taster constantly checking for poison. He stayed at the Red Keep for 4 years, being fed whispers and paranoia by his new spymaster Varys. Toward the end of his reign, the Mad King had become so unhinged that he invited his Warden of the North to King's Landing under the pretext of a discussion, and then burned him and his heir alive in front of 500 people. Had the Mad King had his way, he'd have burned King's Landing to the ground with wildfire, reverse Aryoning the entire city. But Jaime Lannister stepped in before that could happen. Aerys Targaryen and his madness loom large over the Song of Ice and Fire's main timeline, because he unraveled his ancestors' empire in 2 decades, and that takes more than a few loose screws. Serious Targaryen III. When it comes to immediate family members, a question that is often asked is how far does the apple fall from the tree? In the case of Serious Targaryen, it doesn't even make it out of the tree's shadow, because he is the Mad King writ small. Viserys was Aerys' second son that made it out of infanthood, and the Mad King was protective of him from the beginning. A king's guard would be posted at his side day and night. His food would be checked by the king's own food taster, and even Viserys' mother wasn't allowed to see him. When Aerys became convinced that his eldest son Rhaegar was plotting against him, he wanted Viserys to become his heir, and got his chance to do so when Rhaegar died during Robert's rebellion. After Aerys' death, Viserys was declared king, but he had to flee Dragonstone because Stannis Baratheon was approaching the island. The 3rd Targaryen king of his name, Viserys was forced to live in Essos as a pauper, going from city to city begging for shelter, until eventually he became known as the Beggar King. We're sure he was kind to Daenerys in their young age, but years of being mocked and homeless made Viserys bitter, and eventually drove him insane. He sold his sister to Khal Drogo and told her he'd let his whole Khalasar Alzar screw her if he got him the Iron Throne. Viserys tried to steal Dany's eggs when Drogo wasn't moving fast enough for his liking, but when that failed, he decided to take her baby instead. He threatened to cut Dany's baby out of her womb if Drogo didn't keep his end of the bargain, and beneath his talk of protecting his sister and family legacy, Viserys was really just abusing her. He would often lay his hands on her in his fury, calling it waking the dragon. He sold Daenerys to Drogo, but he planned to betray the call and take her for himself, in accordance with Targaryen tradition. Viserys was delirious for a home he didn't even remember, and by the end of his life, he became flagrant enough in its pursuit to end up threatening a Khaleesi in front of her khal. His father's last words in life had been "burn it all." Viserys ended up dying thanks to a pot of molten gold, which became the crown he had desired his whole life. Prince Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven. The final person on our list isn't a madman, but he's probably the most magical Targaryen of all time. Aegon the Unworthy gave the Seven Kingdoms much tragedy and grief, but he also gave it the only Targaryen that is known to have practiced open sorcery. His union with Melissa Blackwood resulted in the birth of a white-haired, red-eyed boy called Brynden, whom men would later come to know as Bloodraven. Upon Aegon's death, Brynden became a prince, but he never pressed his claim, even though he could have easily usurped the throne. Instead, he served as the main branch of the Targaryen family, and stood against the rest of the great bastards, using his skills to fight his half-brothers. Bloodraven served as the hand of the king to two separate kings, but during that time, all knew that he was the one truly in control. Thanks to his mixed dragon and firstman blood, he possessed powers of both ice and fire. Bloodraven could put on a glamour and assume an entirely different identity, which he displays in the third Dunk and Egg novella by turning into Maynard Plum. It was said that he could see through the eyes of ravens and control the minds of wolves, which is probably true considering what happens to him later in life. When he was the hand, he remained laser-focused on the Blackfires, being personally involved in the first three rebellions. He lost his eye during the first, crushed the second with his spying and sorcery, and did the same the third time around. When a Blackfire claimant showed up during the Great Council of 233 AD, Bloodraven offered him safe passage, but then killed him the moment he arrived in Westeros. He stamped out his own half-kin ruthlessly, and neglected other issues in the realm, like the Greyjoy raids, until the last possible moment. Bloodraven was an effective ruler for a time where war could break out at any moment, but him assassinating Aenys Blackfire forced King Egg to send him to the Wall. There he became Lord Commander and led the Night's Watch for 20 years, before disappearing beyond the Wall. He'd be found nearly half a decade later by Bran Stark as the Three-Eyed Raven, having lived well beyond a century thanks to the magic of the werewoods. Prince Brynden Rivers is the most important Targaryen in history, arguably, because he's training the boy that arguably holds the key to the world's future. This magical Targaryen prince's story is still being written, and we expect to see its final act unfurl with the winds of winter. Marvelous verdict. And that's it for this video. Let us know what you thought of our list in the comments below. Don't forget to like it and share it with your fellow Throneheads, and hit that subscribe button to stay updated with the Thrones content this Summer of Dragons. Until next time, stay safe and Dracarys! And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone!